first conversation has to do with the economy. You heard the CBN Governor Laimi Cardoso defending some of the policies that is coming through, and of course the interest rate has now been raised. So I want to see how this affects the economy in general. We're being joined in the program by Johnson Chukwu, is the MD Cowrie Asset Management Limited, and economist. Mr. Chukwu, thank you so much for coming on the program.
Thank you, Jeffrey, for having me. Good morning.
All right, Mr. Chukwu, maybe you help us to speak first to the issue of the increase in interest rate. First, do you agree that it's okay to further increase, although it's not as the other ones, they say it was draconian, but this looks like just 50 basis points. What do you make of this new interest rate?
In the first place, I had predicted that the central bank was likely going to increase the rate by between 25 basis points and 50 basis points. So I had most expected it. And that was coming from the body language of the central bank governor, who had said that as long as inflationary pressure subsists, that they will continue to increase interest rates. But then, if you look at the logic or the reasoning behind the increase, it's a variance with the action they took. The CBN governor had said that the inflationary pressure is coming from increase in food prices as a result of insecurity in the food producing communities, and then increase in energy costs. So these factors will not be addressed by increasing rates. They have to be addressed by increasing food production, as well as stabilizing the exchange rate so that the pass-through effect of increase in exchange rate on fuel prices, on diesel prices will be moderated. The other aspect of energy cost increase is coming from electricity tariff, which part of which, if you look at a multi-year tariff order, part of it is dependent on exchange rate. So if you have a stable exchange rate, the increase in energy costs will moderate. But the greatest pressure is coming from food. And if you look at food inflation at about 40.87%, it has nothing to do with the level of liquidity in the economy. So I think the logic behind the decision is at variance with the action they took. But I had predicted it because they had made it clear, and they had said, the CBN governor had said consistently that his priority is to manage the price level or to maintain price stability. And as long as the pressure subsists, he will or they will continue to increase interest rates.
So I'm wondering, because despite whether it's a draconian or does the moderate increase or the marginal increase, inflation, although the rate month to month is not as aggressive as it used to be, but it's still going up. So is this a question of misdiagnosis in the first instance, or the fundamental legacy issue will continue to tear out whatever policy that the MPC is putting out if they are not addressed at the end of the day? Because we are seeing other systems around the world who have targets, and we're seeing them meeting those targets, inflation tapering, because their fundamentals are not as bad as ours.
Well, it's not a case of misdiagnosis, because, like I said, the central bank governor had said that the pressures is coming from food prices, which is true, that the pressure is coming from pass-through effects of increase in energy costs, which is true, and that, so it's not a case of misdiagnosis. It is more of a case of situation where the central bank is constrained by some structural deficiencies in the economy. If you look at the pressures that we're having today, and you look at what are those factors driving it, we talk about if you disaggregate inflation in the month of June, the greatest pressure is coming from increase in price of non-alcoholic beverages, food and non-alcoholic beverages, followed by increase in energy costs, transport costs. Then you go to increase in housing. These are not, the pressures are not because we are having so much of liquidity in the economy that you and I are borrowing cheap and therefore are demanding for so much goods. We already know that interest rates are high and there's no consumer credit in the country. So in other countries, like you have in advanced countries, the major transmission channel for monetary policy is consumer credit in most economies. And this is the logic of what happens. If you have an increase in interest rates, consumers will be able to borrow either their credit card or whatever means they use to borrow so that they to continue to buy goods and services. As long as they are not borrowing, the demand for goods and services slow down. But those are based on assumption you are dealing with where demand outstrips supply because the demand is also backed by capacity to pay. That's the converse in our own case. We're dealing with collapse of consumer demand, but we're also dealing with high inflation rate. So you don't have money to buy, but then prices are still going up. So it's not a case of demand outstripping supply. You are not going to address it by slowing down demand. What you need is to address the issue of supply. So what we are dealing with in Nigeria is a supply-induced inflation and not demand-induced, not demand pull, but is rather supply driven inflation where you have insufficient supply and then people are trying to scramble with the little money they have for the little goods that are available, which is what's happening in food inflation.
Now let's check on the impact of this increase on manufacturers and other categories of MSMEs. How would it affect them, so to speak? And within the context of that, the federal government had said that it is offering them 1 billion naira credit, as against the high interest rate that has now been pushed up yet again, but they have still not accessed it. But even at 9% for manufacturers, when they eventually access it, how easy will it be for them to be able to, do business in the country in the light of the, other economic realities that they're grappling with?
Interestingly, in Nigeria, the small and medium-scale enterprises and the manufacturers are the worst off in the economic landscape. You know why? They are dealing with too many variables, and most of them are negative. I had mentioned the issue of lack of consumer demand. But at the cost part of it, you are dealing with high energy cost, which the central bank governor alluded to. And then you have to deal with high interest costs. And not only high interest costs, limited access to those funds. Banks are not even lending today. So even with the high interest costs, the banks are not going to give you money. Assuming they give you money and they lend to you at 35%, which is, I think, the minimum most banks are lending at, what kind of business are you doing that you are going to make a gross margin of more than 35% as to pay the bank its interest and still be able to cover your operating costs? So that's one aspect. Then you have to deal with higher increasing operating costs because of existing inflationary pressure. So if the central bank eventually disburses the 1 billion naira per manufacturer, yeah, it will act as palliative. It will probably help some of them, depending on the size of their operation. Most businesses have gone beyond 1 billion naira because of the loss of value of the local currency. But assuming it's a small and medium-scale enterprise that's still working within 1 billion naira operating capital, operating cash flow needs, then it will help a lot. A single-digit inflation will be a game changer for a business that was borrowing at 35% if you have to pay 9%. But you still have to contend with other inclement or constraining factors, which I had mentioned earlier. People are not even buying goods. So there's low demand for goods and services. Two, you have to deal with high energy costs. You have to deal with high other infrastructure costs. You have to deal with unstable labor. A lot of skilled people are leaving the country. So if you are in the manufacturing sector, in the service industry, you have to deal with a lot of the Japa syndrome. Because almost on daily basis, your most competent hands are leaving. You have to deal with that. So these are factors that will continue to constrain the manufacturing sector. But having said that, any palliative is welcome. Any intervention by the government that will reduce one or two of these limiting factors to the manufacturing sector will be welcome.
Now let's move to the other issues affecting the economy, which is the speedy passage of the minimum wage bill. Some would say that it is indeed a welcome development, speaking of the body language of the presidency, particularly amid calls for protest. But let's also, focus on the states and their capacity to pay. Are we looking at another round of consultations and another delay? And based on your knowledge of states and their economic viability, what are you seeing happening within the next month or two?
Because I think any state that wants to pay should be able to pay. It's about prioritizing. If you look at what the states have received in the first 6 months of this year, total amount of PAC allocation that have been received by the states, excluding what they call 13% derivatives, is 2.4 trillion naira. Last year, first 6 months of last year, it was 1.6 trillion naira. So you have seen an increase of about 50% on their PAC allocations. Many states that are forward-looking, that are properly managed, will also be growing their internal generated revenue, because with the loss of value of the local currency, the values that they will be getting would have increased. Then, for those states that are part of the derivative, their income has also further increased. So any state that wants to focus on increasing the wage bill of its employees should be able to do that. I don't think it's a matter of the state can afford it. It's a matter of what are they prioritizing. What is the core? I'll give an instance. Almost every state in the country, the governor receives, takes out security vote at least 500 million naira per month. That will have a huge impact if you have to distribute that evenly to employees in terms of increasing their wage bill or their wages. So I don't think in terms of, it's all about priorities. Like, those state government had already, you could say it has some political connotation, had already started paying 70,000 naira per month. And though it's not a major beneficiary of even the 13% derivative. So I think the state governors should be able to pay. The truth is that you have to balance governance. Governance, they tell you, is about improving the welfare of the citizens as well as the security of lives and properties. If you look at that, then you recognize that that should be your priority number one. Most citizens are going through difficulty, which is why you have alluded to the issue of threatening strike by the citizens or demonstrations. So whatever is required to improve their living standard, the government must do it. That's the first priority of the government in this country. Well, that's what our constitution says.
Mr. Chukwu, just to piggyback on what Bukola asked, that is the ideal. Ideally, with the increased FAC we're seeing across board, we should not be having complaints about ability to pay. But when it was just 30,000 naira, we had some states unable to pay 30,000, and now we have 70,000 naira. It appears we can almost predict that if they can't pay 30, they will not be able to pay 70. In such states, what should be done? How should workers respond to such situation?
If any state, I give an instance. Somebody said that refused to pay the 30,000 were the states that we had the highest level of allegation. Let me use the right word: allegation of the governors mismanaging the state resources. So, like I said, it's all a matter of priority. So, if a state government refuses to pay, and the minimum wage is legislated upon, it's a breach of the constitution that the governor of that state had sworn to protect or to defend. If a governor breaks the law, then the system must find a way of addressing a breach of the law by a governor. Because if it becomes a law, which is why it's going to the National Assembly, it has to be legislated upon, and it becomes binding on all of us as employers of labor. So if a governor cannot pay, then the civil servants should use the legislature to compel the governors to pay. That is assuming things are working properly. Unfortunately, in the country today, the legislatures are integral part of the executive. But assuming you have the checks and balances that our constitution had intended in its format, then the legislature would have called the state governor to order and then probably compelled him to pay. But like I said, it's not a matter of lack of capacity. We've seen a 50% increase in the allocation going to the states across board. And what that means is that if the state governors just reallocate their expenditure and prioritize on payment of salaries and wages, they will achieve that. But also there are caveats. Some states' payroll are filled with ghost workers. Some state governors actually accept that situation because it serves as a conduit for them to sort away money for other political interests. So if you have situations like that, you need to downsize, rightize your public service. You can actually ask people for voluntary retirement and pay them one-off terminal benefits so that you will have a fit and effective civil servants. Because you also need increase in productivity, because when we talk of increase in minimum wage, we also have to align it with the increase in productivity. As you're giving employees higher income or higher remuneration, they also need to produce more to justify the higher income. But it has to be driven by the policies and the effectiveness of leadership at the state and the federal levels.
Mr. Chuku, already we know that the government is already in arrears because they had promised, at least at the federal level, that this payment will start sometime in May, but Labour is even saying it should start sometime in April, given the fact that the other act, this is an amended act, had expired as at the middle of April. But let's move to the issue, just going back to staying with this issue of minimum wage. How is the private sector receiving the news? I know they were part of the negotiation. Is this also going to be a challenge for them?
If I have to use the comments made by the private sector groups like NECA, Nigerian Employers Consultative Assembly, I think the private sector accepted the magnitude of the increase in good faith. Because when I said the magnitude of increase, you remember that the argument by Labour was about 250,000, which the private sector said it would be difficult. It could lead to loss of jobs. But increasing from 30,000 to 60,000 was mostly accepted by the private sector leaders based on what their groups had said. But beyond that, you also, I think Manufacturers Association of Nigeria also thanked and appreciated the president for the increase to 70,000 naira only. But I also recognize that the president said the federal government will support some private sector operators to make sure that they pay that. There's some small and medium scale enterprises that will struggle with it. Like we all know, most businesses are going through some difficulties in the past couple of years. But having said that, if you look at the change in price level, you talked about the inflation rate of about 34.19%. We talk about the food inflation of about 40.87%. So even the prices of your services, most private sector operators have marked it up. In terms of the naira value, not in terms of the real value, in terms of naira value, virtually the revenue of most businesses have grown. So I think if we have to ensure that people that are working for you can eat, find their ways, transport themselves to the office, if you don't pay living wage, you will not get any service. They say if you pay peanut, you get monkeys, because you also want to employ people who are qualified, who are competent, who are committed to the job, and who will produce it. Remember that for private sector operators, it is the income generated by the employees that are used to pay them. So the private sector employers are going to demand for higher level of productivity so they can sustain this. The private sector operators are not constrained in terms of right sizing. They can wake up and say, look, you are not producing, so you have to go. So in the private sector, it's easier because the employees will throw in their best. The management and the leadership will demand for higher level of productivity. And if only we get the economy working, the private sector shouldn't have a problem. But unfortunately, the economy is not working, which is why the central government or the federal government said they will have intervened to support the private sector operators.
Now, the president has written the Senate asking that the 2024 budget be raised by 6.2 trillion naira. Out of that amount, 3 trillion, according to the president, is for recurrent expenditure. We imagine that would have a role to play in the wage bill with the implication of the 70,000 naira minimum wage. I wonder if the subnationals are factored in this as well. But that would raise the budget to over 30 trillion naira. Now, if the expected revenue of the 2024 budget is a little over 18 trillion naira, that would definitely have implications for external borrowing. I wonder if you have concerns in that regard, particularly for our budget, our debt profile, which is already burgeoning?
Yeah, clearly, the federal government increasing the budget from 28.7 trillion naira to about 35 trillion naira will entail that the government will borrow more. I can't see beyond the increase in exchange rate that the government is getting additional naira from conversion of the little crude we are still earning income from. I can't see major revenue here for the government increasing. I think in the next couple of months, we may see even a slowdown in tax revenue because of businesses that are struggling to make profits. Of course, the government has come up with a windfall tax. I don't know if they send that bill, the Finance Act, amended Finance Act has been approved or sent to the National Assembly. Assuming that is not done, then the government will, even at the federal level, they will struggle with meeting the revenue required to fund a budget of 35 trillion naira. So the government has consistently been borrowing. I think the central bank governor even made the allusion that we have received 5.1 trillion naira in foreign investments in the country in the past 6 months. Most of these foreign investments of 5.1 trillion went into purchase of treasury bills, which is federal government borrowing from both local and international lenders. So far, the federal government has borrowed about 19.9 trillion naira this year from through the debt management office by issuance of federal government bonds or through the central bank by issuance of federal government treasury bills. So by the time you throw that into even our national debt, the 121 trillion that we are screaming about will be far, will look like a child's play. So clearly, we are dealing with a situation where our debt sustainability will become a challenge if we continue in the direction we're going. The key thing is that we must make the economy work. We need to improve productivity. The government should focus on how do we improve productivity, starting from agricultural productivity to the manufacturing sector productivity, so that ultimately the cake we bake is higher and the government can extract more revenue from a bigger cake or its share of the value that is added in the economy.
Now, let's go back to the states. I know you said earlier that, with increase in FAC allocation, it's only a matter of willingness of the states to be able to pay 70,000 naira minimum wage, not a matter of their inability to pay, so to speak. But given that even before this time, most states had been dependent on FAC allocation even to pay salaries, how can the states be made more viable, amid this windfall to shore up their internally generated revenue? And of course, to demand accountability of the funds that they're receiving now, such that we can look back at this time and say that indeed the states have judiciously put to use the increased resources that have come to them.
I think the first, starting from the first part of your question, Bukola, which is how do we make the states more economically viable? And that's where we have to come with leadership. Leadership defines everything. And I'll tell you why. There's no state in this country that now has no comparative advantage, economic advantage. Is it in terms of agriculture? Is it in terms of soil minerals, in terms of food, oil production? So every state has something to offer. Look at the northwest states. We are now finding that there are several precious mineral deposits in several of the northern states. Zamfara State is one of the poorest countries in the world, in the country today. But Zamfara State is laden with so much of natural solid minerals that are being exploited. How come that the government over these years, knowing that we have those mineral deposits, never put processes in place to attract appropriate investors that will employ people there and process these raw materials or the impure material, what we call extractive industry, into some level of finished products that we can export, so that they will derive income or tax revenue from the pay as you earn of those employees. So if you go to a state like Benue, you know that they are major agricultural, it's a major agricultural belt. If you go to a country like Kenya, the major export commodity is vegetable and fruits. I mean, flowers. Who said we cannot export vegetables from a Benue or the entire north central part of this country, including Niger State, Nasarawa State? And then all the just put in place a structure that will encourage farmers to go to the farm and produce these things. The key thing, like I said, is that we must encourage, we must elect people who have the mental and leadership capacity to build an economy that is productive.
Mr. Chukwuma, thank you so much. In 1 second, if you will, I know 1 second is impossible. You mentioned leadership. Should we also amend our laws to accommodate some of these things that are in the concurrent list? Because some of them will run to that as an alibi for not doing anything or for lack of creativity.
No, in terms of, I don't think that's the issue around the Constitution. It's all about the quality of people will elect into office. A classical example is Abia State. I'm sure we're all celebrating Abia State. Abia State was a parish state for 24 years. Within 1 year, everybody in the country celebrated Abia State. So what changed? Was it that Aba was imported from another city back to Aba? Or people migrated out of Abia State and new set of people brought in? Just one person took over leadership and redefined the values and the importance or the relevance of the state. And I think we can replicate that across the country.
Well, thank you. MD Cowrie Asset Management Limited and economist Mr. Johnson Chukwu, thank you so much for your insight on this particular subject matter.
Thank you for having me.
All right, we'll take a quick break. When we come back, we'll go to that pharmaceutical subsector of the health sector and bring you up to speed as to what is going on and how the policies of government, whether or not, is impacting that sector positively or negatively. We'll bring you that detail when we come back. Join us again.